Hello, my name is Ella Morrow, and today we will be looking at the Prohibition, which took place during and after World War I. Many of the provinces started and stopped their Prohibition laws at different times, as the first province to have Prohibition in Canada was PEI, starting in 1901 and finishing in 1948. And it became the law in the rest of the provinces during World War I. Throughout this presentation, we will be discussing and referencing back to my main question: did the Prohibition serve its purpose? Here I have a web that represents the holistic spiral. In the center, I have my big idea or my big question, and surrounding it, I have all the interconnecting units that we have covered this year, and also the historical Big Six ideas. First, we will be looking at the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Canada. These women believed that alcohol abuse was the main cause of many issues, such as unemployment, poverty, and violence against women and children. This group was a major part of why the Prohibition took place. Secondly, I wanted to discuss women's suffrage and gaining their right to vote. During World War I, government allowed women who were helping with their army duties at home or related to a man in the army to vote in the federal election. By the 1900s, women were campaigning for both Prohibition and the right to vote. We can see the connection between these two examples and my main idea, because in both cases, women did think the Prohibition would serve its purpose. And for the suffrage movement, it did indeed serve a purpose and help them get voting rights. Now, you may be wondering how these two examples connect to ethical dimensions. Ethical dimensions is understanding historical injustices and what people's sacrifices mean for us today. Had these brave women not stood up for their rights at a time period where women were treated with so much injustice and inequality, we don't know if women would be able to vote and have a platform we do today. During the Prohibition, there were people who sold illegal liquor that was more than likely produced in an illegal still. These people were called bootleggers and rum runners. They would take illegal alcohol and smuggle it across provincial borders. Between them and the police, it was always a game of cat and mouse. Emilio Picarello, otherwise known as the Emperor Pic, the Bottle King, was one of the major bootleggers during the Prohibition, and he did business between BC and Alberta. Later, he was found guilty for murder and was hung in 1923. The smuggling of alcohol to different places across the US border is also a form of globalization. Trade is something that can stimulate economic growth and can connect countries. Now let's ask ourselves, after hearing these 2 points, do you think Prohibition still served its purpose? Considering with these two examples, the Prohibition caused worse things such as crime, murder, and gangsters, in the situation, I would say it definitely didn't serve its purpose. How do bootleggers and rum runners relate to the cause and consequence? The meaning of cause and consequence is more or less, what are the causes that are hidden from view? What are we not seeing? Most illegal businesses try to keep hidden as they don't want to get caught. So as we see during the Prohibition, the underground businesses and production of illegal alcohol was behind the scenes, and the bootleggers didn't want the main focus to be on them. By banning alcohol, it caused many issues and had major consequences, such as illegal activity, bootleggers, smuggling, and murder. As I mentioned previously, the Prohibition caused many other issues in Canada, such as a massive increase in organized crime. Even when alcohol was legal again in Canada, the crime didn't stop, because bootleggers were still making the alcohol and smuggling it south of the border where it was still illegal. We can now connect this to today because even though marijuana is legal in Canada, now people are shipping it to certain places in the USA where it is illegal. This now connects to the interwar decades and the Great Depression because it was a social and economic shock, the same as the Prohibition. It led to a rise in organized crime because people had to find a way to make money. Another major event that went on during the Prohibition was doctors prescribing alcohol. Many people took advantage of this situation, especially in Ontario, where doctors were prescribing approximately 588,000 alcohol prescriptions by 1921. And that wasn't the end of it. That number rose to 815,000 alcohol prescriptions by 1924. As we see today, people are finding loopholes and ways to misuse painkiller drugs by getting doctors to prescribe them drugs such as opioids. These 2 points relate back to my main idea because again, it is showing that the Prohibition made another issue and consequently did not serve its purpose. Does change always mean progress? That is the meaning of continuity and change. And as we see here, change doesn't always mean progress. Many negative things came from the change of having legal alcohol to illegal alcohol. The increase of organized crime and taking advantage of doctors' prescription drugs still haven't progressed and are still going on to this day. We can see certain things we have in today's world that come from and evolved from the past. Most things, especially jobs that have been continued for many years, are government jobs, things like teachers, doctors, police, and ever since Prohibition, liquor stores. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, liquor could be legally produced in Canada but not sold there, and it could be legally exported out of Canada. Then came the start of the Canadian government liquor stores. As we know, during the Prohibition, alcohol was fully banned and illegal for consumption everywhere. Today, there are still laws about where you can and can't drink alcohol. For example, you can't be drinking a beer and walking down the street. So if you look closer, it is almost as if they took some forms of Prohibition and applied it to today. These examples show a side of Prohibition that served a good purpose for the government and allowed them to regulate the sales of alcohol. Also, they can make money off of it. This connects to historical significance because both provincially owned liquor stores and having alcohol laws are things that we carried on from the Prohibition. These are the things that we can use to look back in history to see what we have learned and still hold on to. If we want a reliable source of information, why not look back to the people who lived through it? Here we can see a poster that was drawn in Toronto on June 6, 1885. It says, "War on Women and Children." Another primary source is this picture that was taken in 1897 of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And a quote from Sam Steele, who served in the army and fought in the Boer War. He said, "We soon learn that a compulsion will not make people sober. It must be brought about by the example of the best people. The Prohibition law made more drunkards than if there had been an open bar and free drinks on every corner." By looking back at photos and quotes, we get to understand if these people believed the decision of Prohibition was a good one or not, as these people were the people who had to live through it. How do we know what we know? Who is it coming from? Primary sources are documents, images, or artifacts that provide first-hand or direct evidence concerning a historical topic under research investigation. We can look back to things from the Prohibition, such as quotes, posters, and even pictures, like the ones I've shown previously, to find primary source evidence. As we know, in the Prohibition, the change from being allowed to drink alcohol to then alcohol being legal was a major shock for the Canadians, and with any big change, there's going to be many different opinions on the matter. We can see something similar when we look at the legalization of marijuana in Canada that occurred 3 years ago. This was a very controversial topic for the citizens of Canada, and there was many different opinions on it, just like when the Prohibition happened. With any major change, people worry about the consequences that may result from that change. The Prohibition was seen by most as a social sacrifice. They thought, why should we be spending money on alcohol when it should really be going to the war effort? Just as we saw in both World War I and World War II, Canada had to join together to help soldiers, and everyone had to do their part for a time of total war. Social sacrifice reminded me of what we are all currently going through with COVID-19, such as wearing masks and getting vaccinated. It is almost like a war against a global pandemic, and we have to work together to get rid of this horrible virus. If we look back to Prohibition, it teaches us lessons, and it is something that we can look back to help us with controversial decisions today. We need to understand our past in order to move forward, and there are lessons that our ancestors have taught us that we shouldn't forget, such as social sacrifices we are all currently having to go through regarding COVID. People had to make social sacrifices as well with the wartime effort. Finally, does this answer my big question? Did Prohibition serve its purpose? Throughout the presentation, we have looked at different events that happened during the Prohibition, how it affected Canada, what took place before, during, and after Prohibition. We have also related it to the historical Big Six and the units we covered this year. To summarize it, we know that by having Prohibition, it lowered domestic violence and gave women a platform to speak what they feel and gain the right to vote. But it is also the cause of lots of organized crime and bootleggers. It helped the government by allowing them to start provincially owned liquor stores and make money off of alcohol, and it taught us many things that help us today. But still, after looking at all this information, I still can't definitively say I feel the Prohibition served its purpose or not. Of course, I'm leaning one way more than the other, but that isn't what this presentation is about. I want the final decision to be up to you and your opinion. Here are my resources that I used for this presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something new from my presentation.